Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our Rotary Club. My name is Rich Warfield, the acting Sergeant at Arms. And I just got scolded by our president to get this meeting going. If Ron was here, he would have you whipped into shape. This is not like church on Sunday, okay? All right. So with all that being said, we have Catherine signs to do our prayer. I don't see a tan on her. She does.
First of all, I wanted to say that this is going to be, the invocation is a poem this morning, and I'm sure you've all heard about the random acts of kindness. My shirt is even choose kindness, choose to be kind. I recently was on a flight and the flight attendant was so sweet. And I thanked her and she says, well, kindness, it's a choice. So it is a choice for us all to be kind. Kindness breaks through barriers with words, a smile, a touch. It links us all together in a way that says so much. It shows concern for neighbors, for communities and friends. To be there for each other is the message kindness sends. Reaching out in friendship, taking time to show you care, being the anchor in their stormy lives when they're drowning in despair. Kindness is essential. It's resilient and tough. A global glue to bind us all with gentleness and love. The poem's by Yvonne Carrier. Be kind.
Very nice shirt, dear. As Joe would echo in the Bible, it says, love thy neighbor. And there are plenty of times that we would rather not love our neighbor, but we have to. So with that being as my dog goes on their yard. With that being said, speaking of love thy neighbor, James Young will do the four-way test and the Pledge of Allegiance.
Good morning, Rotarians. Would you follow me in the Pledge of Allegiance? Pledge allegiance to the flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. And now the four-way test of the things we think, say, and do. Number one, is it the truth? Two, is it fair to all concerned? Three, will it build goodwill and better friendship? And fourth, will it be beneficial to all concerned? Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Young. And with that being said, we have the lovely Chris Barker to announce our guest for the day.
Good morning, Rotarians and guests. We have two visitors with us today. If they could please just give us a nice wave so we give them a warm Rotary welcome. We have Jeff Wells, who is a guest of Dave Basil. Thank you for joining us. And then we have David Jones. Not only is he with the Northampton Rotary, he is the district governor of 6630. So thank you for joining us. All right, and Marilyn. Gail, thank you so much for joining us. Sorry, I did not have your name down. So then the next thing we're going to do is we are going to sing today. So today's song is God Bless America. And just in case you do not know all the lyrics, they will be popping up pretty soon. Okay. God bless America, land that I love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. From the mountains to the prairies, to the oceans white with foam. So America, my home, sweet home. God, so America, my home, sweet home. Thank you.
Boy, do we have some talented voices in this room. So now it just hit me why Father Joe wants to get this meeting going pronto. Remember at the end of the meeting, he has like 10 minutes with his sermons and jokes and all that. So he wants to leave time for that. All right. So with that being said, Father, 6-1F does the other. Are you delegating back to me? All right. Introduce it. There you go, dear.
Hi, I'm Mandy. Aunt Mandy, yeah. Our speaker today is Dr. Joseph Ortiz. Dr. Joseph Ortiz is a professor of earth sciences at Kent State University. He holds a PhD in oceanography from the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State University, and a BS in Aquatic Science with honors from Brown University. He completed his postdoc work at the Lamont-Doherty Earth Observation of Columbia University before arriving at Kent State as an assistant professor. His expertise is in climate change, environmental remote sensing, energy resources, and sedimentary geology. He is a longtime resident of Hudson, living here with his wife, Donna, and children since 2001. His two children both graduated from Hudson High School, having completed their entire K-12 education in the district. He enjoys hiking, outdoor photography, and is the vice chair of the Hudson Environmental Awareness Committee. With that, I'll introduce Dr. Ortiz.
Thank you very much for that gracious welcome. It's a pleasure to be here this morning and to have the opportunity to talk to my fellow residents and the Rotarians here who are our city leaders. And I'm thrilled also with the fact that we have members of the school board and the city council here to hear what I have to say today. And what I'm going to talk about is something that I think is really amazing. We talk about the importance of lifelong learning, right? And one of the things that I found in the work that I've been doing recently is just being amazed at how rapidly we are transitioning in our energy systems right now. And so that's what I want to talk to you about today. I want to talk to you about the energy transition and about the environment and climate. And so on this first slide, this is research that was done by RMI, which is a consultancy firm or a non-governmental group that's looking at the rate of change of energy through time. And so this goes from the late 1880s to 2020. And what they're showing is the rate of change or the changes in how we get our energy. And if you look here, you can see this is coal, oil, and gas. And the amount of energy that we get from those is quite large. It's the majority of the energy that is driving our society on a global scale. But you can see the rate of change, the slope of this line is relatively flat, right? So there was a rapid growth in during the Industrial Revolution, but since the mid 1980s or so, that rate of change has decreased, right? If we look over here, what we can see is this very steep climb, and this is the rate of change of energy from wind and solar and batteries, right, through time. So battery backup for grid scale, large scale processes. And you can see that the rate at which we're adding new energy from renewable resources is much faster than the rate at which we're adding new energy to the system from fossil fuels, right? And so this is a fundamental transformation in terms of how we're getting the power to drive our society on a global scale, right? Unprecedented, right? So next. And if we look at how we use energy, right? This is a flow diagram, an energy flow chart that shows what we use to power our society. This is for an example for the US, but you could do this globally. You could do it for each of the different countries in the world. And on the left here, what we see is what's referred to as primary energy. Right. So primary energy refers to the means in which we get that energy or power. Right. And you see over here, there's another box. This is labeled electricity. This is secondary energy. Right. So electricity is secondary energy because it can be generated from each of these other power sources. Right. But I ask you, right, does electricity have to be secondary energy? Or can it be primary energy? Right. Well, we can get electricity from wind and solar and hydropower without adding any additional fuel into that process. Right. And so electricity from renewables is in fact primary energy. Right. Electricity as secondary energy is only secondary energy if it's generated by fossil fuel. Right. So now we follow these pathway of these energies to the pink boxes. And the pink boxes represent energy services. So this is what we're actually using to run our society. And in the final row here, we see two boxes. The black box is labeled energy services, and this gray box has a wonderful euphemism on it. It's called rejected energy. Right. Well, rejected energy is a fancy way of saying waste. Right. It's waste heat. Right. The units that we're looking at here are quads, right? One quad is a quadrillion BTUs of energy. It turns out that 67% of the energy that we use from fossil fuels is actually lost as waste heat. It does nothing to help us, right? We run our entire society on just 33% of the energy that we burn as fossil fuels. And the reason why this happens is because of the inefficiencies in the internal combustion engine, right? Technology that was originally created towards the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and which has reached the end of its advancement stage, right? So we lose 67% of primary energy as waste heat. Now, in contrast with electric motors are extremely efficient. Right. So most electric motors can have efficiencies of 90 to 95%, which means that we're only losing about 10 or 20% of the energy from the inefficiencies in the electric motor and from transmission processes and so on when we transfer electricity. Right. So in principle, if we take everything that we're using that runs on fossil fuels and we convert it to electric, right, we could actually get by with only 1/3 of the energy that we're using, or roughly 1/3 of the energy that we're using. In fact, to provide us with a buffer, estimates that are made, say, well, let's double the amount of energy that we're generating. We'll still have plenty of energy and much less waste, right? So we get something for nothing effectively by switching from fossil fuels to much more efficient renewables. Okay, so that's a key point to keep in mind. Can we go to the next, please? And we can see that that's driving a transition in how we use energy, right? So this is a plot from the U.S. Energy Information Agency, the EIA, and what it shows is the proportion of generation that is being used in the U.S. to get energy for the grid. And so it's a mix of nuclear, coal, natural gas, hydropower, wind, solar, and then other sources, right? Which is a relatively modest fraction. If we look at this in terms of percentages, what we can see is the fraction of coal that we're using has been decreasing with time because of economic drivers, right? And the fraction of gas that we're using peaked and is now starting to decrease as well, right? Nuclear is flat. Hydropower is flat in the US, and the two forms of energy, of electricity that are rising are wind and solar, which together are often referred to as renewables. So why are we seeing these transitions? Next. The reason why we're seeing these transitions is because of the costs, right? So how do we use our energy in our society, right? Well, this breakdown shows what we do with energy. We use it for transportation. We use it to power our homes. We use it for heating and cooling, either as gas or electric for the most part. We use it for operating our homes. So for cooking, for hot water, for lights, appliances, outdoor grounds equipment. And if we look on a societal basis, we see that about 27% of our energy comes from transportation, about 24% is used by industry, 13% for commercial and residential, agriculture is an 11%, and electricity accounts for 25% of the energy usage. Next. What's really interesting about this is, in addition to the waste that I mentioned in the earlier part of the slide, in terms of all the energy that's lost through fossil fuel burning, we can also think about how efficiently we're getting that energy through the generation process and the production process. And so this is done with a metric known as the energy return on investment, or EROI, right? So EROI is a measure of how much energy we get from a particular type of energy based on the amount of energy that we needed to get it to the point where it's useful, right? Now, over the years, it turns out that people were not calculating the EROI accurately, right? Because when they were doing their calculation, because of the way the data was stored, they were only making the calculation to the mine mouth or the wellbore head, right? So they calculate the amount of energy that it took to drill the oil out of the ground or to bring the coal out of the mine, but then they didn't factor in the energy costs associated with transportation, associated with refining and transmission and so on, right? With new data sets that are available that allow us to combine all that information, when you go through and look at that, you can see what the actual final energy return on investment from these values are, right? And when you do that, what you see is that fossil fuels have seen their ERO final shift here from the 1990s at about 40 down to values of about 30 in 2011. This is for the primary. If we look at the final, we see that they sit very close to a value of 6 or 7, right? Close to this so-called net energy cliff of 5, right? So a value lower than 5, you're putting so much energy to try and extract that energy that you're not getting back enough to actually use it usefully for society, right? In contrast, what we've seen is with the deployment of renewables, improvements in technology and learning, the renewables have been shifting in this direction towards from a value of about 5 up to a value of 30, right? Making them much more efficient. And if we think about this, and if you understand how we get fossil fuels, this makes sense, right? So when we find a reservoir of oil and gas, how much of that oil and gas do you think we can extract as primary energy in the first round of extraction? Turns out to be about 20%, right? So that first 20% we get really cheap because it comes out pressurized by the pressures within the reservoir, right? Once you lose that pressurization in the reservoir, now you have to expend more energy in order to move that oil, right? In order to get it out, right? And if you think about the trends that we've seen, right? We've gone to horizontal drilling and we've gone to fracking, right? Well, with fracking, what you do is you pump water and energy down into the rock, which takes tremendous amounts of energy to bust up the rock in order to create more permeability so that you can move the gas out of the source rock, right? So a reservoir or a geologic reservoir that has oil in it consists of 3 different rock types, right? You have the source rock that is high in organics that generates the hydrocarbons. You have the reservoir which holds the hydrocarbons, and you have a cap rock, right? So we've moved now beyond the state where we're looking for oil in the reservoir rock and are going directly to the source rock in order to pull the oil and gas out of that source rock. It takes hundreds of millions of years for oil and gas to form. So if we're at the point where we're mining the source rock, right, we've reached the limit of that resource, right? Or we're looking offshore into offshore environments, or we're starting to process oil shales and tar shales and so on, which require lots of water in order to process out the material from there. So processing of oil and gas has become much more expensive. Next. And if we look at what studies have been done, there have been hundreds of studies now that have been conducted that say we can actually transition our society to running on 100% renewable energy, wind, water, solar, hydropower, right, as water. This is from a paper that analyzed the results from over 660 publications. This is the growth in the number of papers that have analyzed this result. And at the bottom, what we see is the comparison of the results from these theoretical studies. And so what they plotted here was solar power, percentage of electricity gained by solar power versus the percentage of electricity gained from wind. And this line represents the 100% line, right? So in many of these early studies, they predicted that there would not be very deep penetration of renewables into the grid because they were making use of the then current price of electricity from renewables, right, which was high. And so they predicted that it wouldn't be economically feasible, right? More sophisticated recent studies have factored in the learning curve, right? People are familiar with Moore's law and how the size of our chips has become smaller and our computers have become more powerful, right? So there's a learning law that describes how technology improves and becomes cheaper as we deploy more of it, right? So as you start to develop an economy of scale, it causes the cost of your ability to bring a product to market to drop, which is what we're seeing, right? When you factor in that kind of economic data into the models, now they start to predict that we'll see large fractions of wind and solar incorporated into the grid, which is exactly what's happening. All right. So this is theoretical data. Let's look at what's actually happening in the real world. So next. And when we do that, this is actual data. This is from Ember. And what's plotted here is the amount of energy as wind, water, solar, and other renewables versus hydropower. Right, so I plot it this way because wind, water, and solar are often referred to as, wind and solar are often referred to as variable renewable energy, right? Because the wind is variable or the sun doesn't always shine, there are clouds and so on, right? Versus hydropower, which we can think of as baseload energy, right? Because as long as we have adequate water within the reservoir, we can generate power from it. And if we look at this, what we can see is there are already 4 nations on Earth today that are running at 100% wind, water, solar, right? There are 51 nations that are running with more than 50% of renewables in their grid, wind, water, solar, and other renewables, right? And now if you build out batteries, right, in order to firm up your wind and water, your wind and solar, you now have the ability to store that energy when it's created and then to use it when you need it, right? And so this all becomes possible because of economics, right? So next slide, please. And this is what's driving that economics, right? So if we look early in 2009, we can see that the cost of wind and solar was high, right? But over the past decade, the cost of wind and solar has dropped precipitously and is now the cheapest way that we know to make energy on our planet. It's cheaper than gas, it's cheaper than oil, it's cheaper than nuclear power by a lot, right? And moreover, it's efficient in terms of what it can be used to operate and so on. So if we look at the different ways that we generate energy, right, on our grid, there's 3 different types of plants. There are baseload plants, which we keep on more or less all the time or as much as possible. There's what's referred to as mid-merit or load following plants. And then there are peaker plants, right? Over the past couple of years, wind and solar, have gotten to the point where they are now cheaper than all of those different types of electric grid production, right? So a recent study concluded that wind and solar renewables were cheaper than 99% of the coal-fired power plants in the United States that are in operation, right? And wind and solar with 4 hours of battery backup were cheaper than 60% of the baseload coal-fired power plants in the US, right? So this is where we're going, right? If you're given the choice between paying $120 per megawatt hour for coal or 163 per megawatt hour for nuclear or 60 for natural gas versus 37 and 40 for wind and solar, we know where you're going to go, right? If you have the ability, you're going to transition to that, and you're going to do it as quickly as possible, because the sooner you transition, the more you're saving, right? Next. And if we add, this is just another compendium that shows the same kind of results. What I like about this is they've also added the cost of battery storage onto this as well, right? Because that's what we need in order to firm up the grid. And because of COVID, you can see that the cost declines have stalled. In fact, for battery storage, they've gone up a little bit, but we're still seeing the build out of battery storage, and battery storage at this point is now cheaper than nuclear power, right? And we don't need a tremendous amount of battery storage in order to operate the grid for most of the time, right? So I've seen studies that have concluded that 4 hours of battery backup storage are sufficient for 90 to 95% of our seasonal energy needs, right? There's a short period of time, generally on the order of about 2 weeks or so, that there's inadequate wind and solar to drive those transitions, right? So we can back those up. Okay, next, please. And we can see that many different forms of renewable energy are now cheapest, right? So what's shown here in gray is the range of fossil fuel costs. And for comparison, we see solar, voltaic, concentrating solar, offshore wind, and onshore wind and offshore wind, excuse me. And all of those are either less expensive than fossil fuels or competitive with fossil fuels. There's two different types of data that are shown here, right? So one of those are auction database values, and the other is levelized cost of energy, right? So levelized cost of energy is a calculation that takes into account all of the capital expenses, so what it costs to build the station, and all of the operating expenses, right? And then it figures out what the average cost is per unit production, right? The auction prices, those are interesting, right? So those are for power purchase agreement prices. And so an area, a government or whatever will announce a lease for a region where they want to build a plant that could be onshore, it could be offshore, and then companies come in and they bid what they think they'll be able to generate that electricity for based on their market knowledge, right? That happens months before the plants are even built, right? What's remarkable about this is that we can see for onshore wind and for solar photovoltaics, those two data sets agree, right? The only way those two data sets can agree is if the market is efficient. If people really know how much it's going to cost to bring the product to market, and if they can actually hit that target, right? So that's really huge to see this agreement between those two. Okay, so next slide, please. And as I mentioned, the learning curve is driven by Wright's law, which says that as we increase the build out of a product or and the technology improves, and we learn better how to build it cheaper, we can decrease cost. And so you can see that renewables have resulted in that massive decrease in cost that allows them to become so effective, right? So next slide. And we see that this is happening not just in the US, but also globally, right? So what's plotted here is the growth of hydropower, nuclear, and renewables, wind and solar, through time. And we see that within the next 2 or 3 years, wind and solar is predicted to outpace hydro. They've already crossed past nuclear and will continue to build out. All right, next slide, please. And in terms of that transition, what this plot shows is globally how rapidly we're making that transition, right? So what's plotted here is the fraction of different sources of new capacity that's being added to the global grid, right? And the headline that they have here, solar was half of capacity installed, but that's not really the big headline. For me, the big headline is that 86% of the new capacity that was put in globally was wind and solar, was renewable. Right? That's for the world as a whole. If we look to developed nations, it's 96%. If we look to the developing world, it's still 75%. Right? So everywhere around the world, nations are making the transition to renewable energy because it's cheaper, right? And it provides resilience because you can have multiple grids and lots of redundancy, distributed energy to minimize the risk that a single power plant failure can result in major problems. Next slide. And we can see that how the grid is being built out varies from nation to nation. So this is the US, and we can see that in the US, 70% of the new solar that's being put in is utility scale, whereas 30% is rooftop, right? In Australia, these numbers are flipped, right? And it's 70% rooftop and 30% grid scale, right? So it depends on what the local geographic distribution is. In Australia, they have less transmission, and people are living much further apart, and so it makes sense to have rooftop solar as the primary form that's being used. Next. Okay, so why do we need to make these transitions? I've made the economic case so far for why there's really good economic reasons, but in addition to that, there are environmental and climate related reasons, right? So this is from a recent study that concludes that if we exceed 1.5 degrees of global warming, that we run the risk of crossing a number of important climate thresholds, right? So these are related, for example, to the melting of permafrost. When you melt permafrost, that allows organics in the sediment to decay and to release methane into the atmosphere, which will drive further warming, or changes in ocean circulation that will drive increases in warming further, right? So we run the risk of potential runaway greenhouse or feedback. So, or melting of the southern ice sheets in the West Antarctic that run the risk of rapid sea level rise, right? Okay, so next. If we look at where we sit now in terms of these transitions, this is increasing temperature relative to the planet before we started the Industrial Revolution. And what's shown here is the rate of change of temperature in response to the policies that are in place, right? And so if we were to just take the current policies that we have in place right now and continue with them through 2100, the planet would most likely warm between to 2.5 degrees or so, right? If instead we take the current policies plus the predictions that we say we're going to include in the coming years, then we'll probably be able to cut us down to about 2 degrees of warming, right? So if we go to the next slide, this one's really busy. I'll try to walk us through this, right? So this, that earlier slide was an assessment of this paper. And what's shown here is the projection out through 2100, right? So these are based on nationally determined contributions. That's basically the amount of emissions that each nation has said that they'll agree to trying to limit to. And so if we look at what would happen if we just took those, what we're planning to do through 2030 and applied those and nothing else, then we might see temperatures as low as 1.5 degrees, but we could see temperatures as high as 3.5, and with greater probability, we'd probably be somewhere around 2.5 degrees or so. In order to make this happen, or not make this happen, and to keep it below 2 degrees, we have to decrease the amount of emissions that we're generating, right? So this shows the emission pathways associated with each of these different scenarios. So the orange ones are the emission pathways that lead to 2.5 degrees. The blue pathways are the ones that lead to less than 2 degrees, right? So the long and short of this is, in order to try and minimize an overshoot of the 1.5 degree climate threshold, we need to rapidly start to decrease the amount of fossil fuels that we're burning, right? So there's a climate-related reason or an environmental-related reason, and if we make that transition, we'll save money in the long run, because we've seen that renewables are now cheaper than fossil fuels. Next. Okay, and so this shows where we sit in terms of our progress with respect to emissions. And so if we look at just the total fossil fuel emissions, what we see is that we've fallen below one of these higher emission scenarios, RCP 8.5, which is good. But if we factor in land use changes, right, so deforestation and so on, what we can see is, even though we flatten that curve out, we're still following along that higher emission curve, right? We haven't started to heal over and go towards reduced emissions, although the most recent data seems to show that emissions are starting to plateau, which is good, right? Okay, next slide. So what happens, right? If we continue along this red pathway of relatively high emissions, predictions are that we could see damage to the US economy of as much as 10 or 12% drop in GDP, right? If instead we follow along one of these lower emission pathways, then we can keep the impact on the US economy to the kinds of downturns that we see in a typical business cycle, right? On the order of 2 to 3% and fluctuating. Okay, next slide. So what's going to happen, or what is happening that we're seeing now? So these are model results for what changes in precipitation will look like in a warmer world. And the patterns differ somewhat for the different seasons. But what we can see from this area, or these assessments, is that we'll see most likely wetter winters and drier summers and spring, right? This is the pattern that we're seeing right now in our town, right? One of the things that's been projected, we're known in this area for lake effect snow, right? So lake effect snow occurs when we have cold winter storms that happen when the lake has not frozen over yet, right? If you freeze over the lake, there's no moisture source from the lake for that those cold storms, winter storms, the Alberta Clippers, to carry moisture in that turns into snow, right? Well, the planet isn't changing the direction in which it's rotating, and the major weather patterns are staying about the same, but the temperature is becoming warmer. So what happens is now the lake doesn't freeze over. Those dry northern airs pick up water from the lake, but it's too warm to produce snow. So instead of getting lake effect snow, we get lake effect rain, right? Which is why we have much wetter winter seasons that we're seeing now. Okay, next slide. And if we look at the warming patterns, we can see that in Ohio, in our area in the Midwest, unless we reduce emissions, we can expect to see much warmer temperatures throughout the year. And so this is one of the things that's kind of interesting about how climate change is driving shifts, right? Because we're seeing a transition towards both wetter and drier conditions, right? Towards more variable conditions throughout the year, so that we'll get massive rainfall, which leads to potential flooding issues, right? And the city is doing a great job right now of implementing flood control features and planning for the 500-year flood rather than, say, the 100-year flood, which I think is a really smart move given the transitions that that we can expect in our system. Okay, next slide. And if we look at the economics of this, this is a slide from a company called Munich Re. Anyone here in insurance know about Munich Re? So Munich Re is a reinsurance company, right? In fact, they're the largest reinsurance company on the planet. And so they're really concerned about anything that's going to cause them to have to make bigger payouts in the future for their policies, right? And so what they've done is they've tracked different types of disasters over time. And so what they show is that what they classify as environmental disasters, so meteorological or hydrological disasters have been increasing, but so-called geophysical disasters have not, right? So earthquakes are happening at the same rate that earthquakes are happening, tsunami are happening at the same rate that tsunami are happening, volcanoes and so on. But hurricane damage, damage from tornadoes, damage from floods has been increasing because of the connection between fossil fuel burning and land use changes and warming conditions on the planet, right? So as a result of that, Munich Re has announced that they're no longer going to insure fossil fuel related infrastructure projects globally, right? If you want to build your fossil fuel related project, you can do it, but you got to find somebody else to insure them because the biggest insurance company in the world is no longer going to do it, right? And that trend is happening from an economic standpoint, right? Not necessarily a policy standpoint, which is, I think, really remarkable. Next. So if we look, this is as of 2017, right? We can look to see what's happening since then. But what this shows, this is from the National Climate Assessment, the fourth National Climate Assessment, and they ranked how each of the different states was working towards protecting itself and its citizens from the potential impacts of climate change, which are ongoing. At the time, Ohio ranked in the bottom 20 states in terms of its preparation and work towards doing that. So, you know, what that says is that locally we have the opportunity to make up that difference, right? To make a change, to try and do what we can to protect our interests. Next. And so how do we respond, right? So just to recap where we've been through, renewables are now the cheapest way to generate energy. We waste about 2/3 of the energy that we get from fossil fuels. If we transition over to renewables, we can make use of more fraction of the energy that we want to. And you know, how is that not, you know, the American way, right? You know, Yankee, you know, thrift. So there are lots of things that we can do that we can make a difference here locally, right? So next. There's a number of different strategies that can be put in place. So this is from a study that was done by Princeton University called the Princeton Wedge Approach. And so what they do is they define a 50-year sliver of time and emissions and said how many wedges would we need to cut out in order to minimize CO2 emissions, right? And at the time that they first generated this approach about 15 years or maybe more ago, they concluded that we would just have to deploy at scale 4 of these wedges, right? The last time I looked, it was 8, right? Because we continue to put more CO2 into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels. But you can see that there's lots of different techniques here. And since they developed this, I've even been able to add some new wedges that weren't included in that. So battery electric and heat pumps now are much more efficient than they were previously. In addition to that, we have geothermal and district heating, concentrating solar, which is now competitive. That wasn't at the time that they did that. So we have many more types of technology that we can deploy make a difference. There are some that were listed here that are probably no longer as efficient in terms of use. Carbon capture and storage. Billions of dollars have been spent on carbon capture and storage, and they repeatedly they've been unable to meet the targets for the amount of emissions reduction that are necessary. And if you think about it, it makes sense because you're fighting against entropy, right? So you burn all this material, and now you've got to spend more energy to take that carbon and sequester it without getting much benefit from it, right? Or fuel switching, right? Changing from coal to gas. At this point now, renewables are cheaper than coal and gas, so just go straight to renewables rather than fuel switching. Next. And so we can make a difference. This is what we did in my household when we were tracking this. We were able to cut our energy consumption from our electricity by a factor of 2, just by changing from incandescent bulbs to compact fluorescent, and then from compact fluorescent to LED bulbs, and swapping out our appliances, right, for more efficient appliances. Now our electricity usage has gone up a bit because I drive an electric car, but we've reduced the emissions associated with that. Next. And our city is already doing stuff along these lines. So at our city hall, these are the Daikin heat pumps that power that hall. These are some of the most efficient heat pumps on the market today. There's information here that you can get from the Department of Energy about the efficiency ratings and savings. This is obsolete in terms of the savings here because there's the new Inflation Reduction Act, which increased the incentives that you can get for those. So next. And this is from a company called HVAC 2.0. You can look them up. They were actually founded by a Hudson resident, which is kind of cool. And what it shows is performance of various types of heat pumps. And so what's plotted here is temperature on the x-axis, and then this is heat output in BTUs per hour. And so notice that many of the heat pumps follow this trend that their efficiency decreases with temperature. This is old technology, right? These are old style heat pumps. If you use a new cold climate heat pump, right? Cold climate heat pumps can maintain their efficiency across the full temperature range down to -5 or -10 degrees. So they work in cold climates. Maine, I was just talking with one of the members here. Maine has a big program in operation right now to get people to switch off of bunker, off of fuel oil, and onto heat pumps because of the improvements in energy efficiency and savings and air quality that will come from that, right? So cold climate heat pumps work very well in our area. There's only about 20 days of the year that get down to -20 in this area. And in fact, those days are decreasing with time because of climate change. Next. And solar works here in Ohio as well, right? So one of the things that I was interested in was how much energy can you get from solar in Ohio? And so I went through and compiled this data that shows array size versus annual output for this. And one of the things that's really interesting is Kent State now gets 37% of its electricity for its regional campuses from solar power, right? From power purchase agreements for solar power that they've installed. And with a new power purchase agreement for wind that was put in place, we now get 19% of our electricity overall from renewables. If we look at the open circle here, this is a new Kent State solar array with battery backup that's being built and will go online soon. Once that comes online, Kent State will move to about 24% of its electricity from renewables, right? The first of the systems that we put in place was on the field house, right, in 2012. Do you know how much money we paid to put that in place at the time of installation? Nothing, not a cent, because we entered into a power purchase agreement with a company. The company installed at no cost, and we agreed to buy power from them over a set term in order to deal with that. And over that time period, those panels were supposed to have a degradation of about 0.5% per year in terms of output. The measured degradation from those solar panels has actually been 0, right? Today, in 2023, 10 years into their lifespan, they're still producing as much energy as the day they were installed, right? And they have a 20-year lifespan, which means they're probably going to live longer than that 20-year lifespan, right? So the sooner that you convert over, the more savings you get. Next. And there's lots of programs around that can help us, right? So if you're on First Energy here in Ohio or in Hudson, you can switch over your energy generation to 100% wind power or solar, right? That's what I do. So that allows us to save money and reduce our emissions. And it's as simple as filling out a web form. And so once a year or once every 2 years, we just look at around for a better rate and switch over to doing that. Next. Just some more information. You can do this with residential, commercial, and so on. We've got enough time. Okay. So let's go to the next slide. And this is just about efficiency. We've talked about this previously. So 70 to 80% efficiency for EVs, 10 to 20% for internal combustion engine. Next. And so you save money by switching to an electric car, right? So this is a comparison of what I pay per year to run my electric car versus the price of gas at $5 per gallon. I pay 3.3 cents per mile. So, I'm saving at least a factor of 2 or more, depending on the efficiency of the vehicle you're trading in from. Next. And with that efficiency comes also reduction in emissions. So this is my vehicle here at 3.8 miles per kilowatt. So after 2 years of operation, I create less emissions than an internal combustion car that gets 40 mpg. Next. Or a hybrid after 4 years. Next. Or if we go to a plug-in hybrid. In order to have the same level of emissions that I get in my car, a plug-in hybrid like the Prius Prime, which has the best efficiency, would have to run 90% of the time as in electric mode. But its battery only allows it to go about 40 miles in electric mode, whereas mine allows me to go 220 to 300 miles, right? So I'm not carrying around an extra engine that I'm not using, right? Next. And of course, you can also transition your lawnmower to battery electric. So my battery electric lawnmower costs me about 50 cents to mow my lawn, right? And so a better way to go, right? Less emissions, it's quieter, it's lighter, easier to use. Next. And there is money that's available from the federal government to enable school buses to be converted to battery electric. Next. And for schools to put in solar and wind. Next. And just some examples that folks are doing it here. So Dayton and many other school districts have already implemented this. Next. And with the passage of the infrastructure bill and the IRA, there's additional funds to build out charging networks for EVs. Next. And this is an article that shows there's $416 billion related to energy and climate that's going to be invested over the next 10 years. Next. Okay, so what can we do, right? So we can implement conservation efforts. We can switch from an air conditioner to a heat pump to save on money. We can purchase electricity from a renewable source, or install renewables, or drive an EV, right? Lots of different ways that we can save. Next. And so just to summarize then, transitioning to renewables will save us money and reduce emissions and decrease our impact on the environment. And there's federal sources of funding to help us make that transition, right? So last slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for coming in, and wow, what a tour de force. We're really close on time. I know you have to go, but maybe if there's one, could you take maybe one question?
I'd be happy to.
One person with a burning itch, you got a question you want to bring up? Do it.
Hey, Joe.
Hey.
On your EROI slide, why was there a miss on those calculations for mine, for transportation, and the refining? That seems like a glaring miss.
Yeah, you know, I don't necessarily know the answer to that. It could be that the data was not available. It might be that people just weren't thinking it through. Or I don't know, maybe somebody didn't want us to know what the final number was, you know? So, but that's the new estimates that have come out that show that. Yeah, and you know, I'll just mention that I have a talk on EVs, a full talk like this on EVs. I'd be happy to come back and spend some more time to talk with the group here.
Can I put you to work real fast? Sure. All right. We have a raffle here.
All right.
And it's I got money in this game, so I can't pick myself. Payout's $11 today. Jackpot 135. And if you'd pull out a
Not looking.
not looking
Here
or
we go. Got two. Here we go. All right. You want me to read the ticket number? All right. So ticket number is 923010. That's 923010.
how about that? Well done, you.
I don't know this guy. There's your winning.
Oh, you just saw
Something like
something
you should hold on. to
Oh,
it.
okay. I'll take a winning ticket. All right. Oh, and now you got to do one more thing. Okay. Inside here, you see there's a black,
Uh-huh.
you know, and so if you'll just kind of hold that, no, hold. I'll let you pick for me. Yes. You. All right. Right. There you go.
There we go.
All right.
What are we doing?
Pull out one.
Pull out one. Okay. And
And it's not a black one. All right. Thank you so much. We'll give that to me. All right. One more round of applause. Thank you so much, Dr. Ortiz, for coming. Fascinating. I just have a quick announcement, and that is that there is a board meeting following this meeting. So if you're a board of directors meeting, will you please hang around for that? And then also that we are still gathering for Freedom House, a home for veterans in Kent. And so there's a list of things that we need for that. And remind me real fast, Terry, what those are. First. Non-perishable, right. Okay. Okay, so we'll collect that throughout the month, and if you can bring those in, be great. Carrie takes cash. She's old fashioned like that. Thank you all for coming. Be great today. Have a great day.